about record keeping? I would imagine people probably have to keep receipts or record to some extent. What does that look like? Like, what's recommended for HSAs?
So in general, if you're paying or reimbursing yourself for expenses being paid from an HSA, just keeping the receipts of what those transactions were to show that they were actually qualified medical expenses, 3 years after you incur the expense essentially is the guideline,
Okay.
or basically 3 years after you file the tax return, I should say.
Okay.
Just making sure to keep those receipts afterwards. There's another side of things where, like I mentioned, you don't need to necessarily use all your HSA money in 1 year.
Right.
You also don't need to reimburse yourself for expenses in the same year you actually pay them. So if you have a surgery or something that you pay for this year, you can wait 5 years before paying yourself back from the HSA. In that
No
case,
kidding.
you can wait for a long time before
Wow.
actually reimbursing yourself for medical expenses from the HSA. So if you decide to do that, if you decide to reimburse yourself later for expenses you incurred this year, you need to actually keep more in terms of tax records for the year that you actually incurred the expense, because the IRS wants to know that you didn't already reimburse yourself from the HSA, that you didn't write it off on Schedule A as an itemized deduction. They want to make sure you weren't reimbursed in any way for that expense. So not only do you need to keep that receipt until you actually reimburse yourself for that expense, but you also need to kind of hang on to your tax forms, your tax records, to make sure that it's clear that you didn't already reimburse or deduct that expense.
Okay. So making sure that you keep track of stuff's important when we have HSA. So you can't just, have it, spend it, not keep track of anything. You do really need to have some discipline here and make sure you're tracking stuff. So
yeah, really nice to have a scanner of some kind and, a Dropbox or a Google Drive file or something that you can just stash those receipts in for every year. Yeah. So just, you have them, you don't have to worry about pulling them out of a shoebox or something.
Yeah. Or even like an Excel spreadsheet with those receipts. Do you see people do that too? Like making a spreadsheet throughout the year and document it that way?
You can do a spreadsheet to keep track of your expenses for sure, but the IRS won't necessarily take that as as the same evidence as like a receipt.
Yeah, they want the receipt.
Since it doesn't actually constitute proof of like what you spent on. So the spreadsheets can be helpful for figuring out how much you actually took out of it, but the IRS will want to see actual receipts.
Okay. Well, very good.